I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are meeting. Tonight, a high-profile public servant steps aside over bombshell text messages, putting the nation's COVID response under the spotlight and the real-life succession plan of a media mogul. Joining our panel, award-winning actress Madeleine West. She's also an author and child protection advocate. Labor member for Wills, Peter Khalil. He's also the chair of the powerful Intelligence and Security Committee. Liberal Senator for Queensland, Paul Scarr, who's the deputy chair of the Referendum No Case Committee. Chief Executive of GetUp, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts. She is a proud, widgeable, viable woman from the Bundjalung Nations. And broadcaster Tom Elliott. He's the host of 3AW's Drive Show. Also tonight, tackling the scourge of assaults on university campuses. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Saga Sekon.
In light of today's headlines featuring Home Affairs Secretary Michael Pezzullo, how do we ensure that Australia's intelligence and security interests remain free from political interference? What measures can government and public servants take to ensure that the Australian Public Service Code of Conduct is strongly upheld at all levels?
Peter Khalil, I might start with you there.
Thanks, Patricia. A very good question, Saga. I actually spoke to the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, this morning, and she informed me that there was a decision made to ask the Secretary to stand aside and also referred an investigation to the Australian Public Service Commission, and that was also backed in, obviously, by the Prime Minister who spoke about it. There's a real need there to act swiftly, obviously with such serious allegations in the reporting we've seen over the weekend. And the reason for that is partly what you alluded to. Impartiality, non-partisan advice, apolitical advice. These are fundamental principles of a good public service. And so anything that threatens that needs to be acted on very, very swiftly, and that's what they've done. I think I saw also the Prime Minister was very keen on expediting that investigation and having those findings be brought forward so that they can make a decision on that. So that's really important that they've taken that action today.
George Brandis has written that no minister, Labor or Liberal, could trust him again. Do you agree? Could you trust him?
This is a decision for the government, for the Prime Minister and the Home Affairs Minister with respect to that particular individual. I'd let the Australian Public Service Commission run its course because, as Saga alluded to, they will be looking at any breaches of the Australian Public Service Code.
OK, but we've seen the text messages. They're really explicit. It's not confusing what's going on here. Do you think it's appropriate?
Then the findings will be decided
Can you see how
by the Public Service Commission.
Defended?
I think it's important, though, Patricia, that we're the adults in the room. We conduct a proper investigation. We let the Public Service Commissioner hand down the findings to the Prime Minister and to the Home Affairs Minister, and for the government to make that decision on that basis. There's proper processes here, and we're going to do that. That's partly why I was talking about the importance of the public service, the separation of powers, the role and responsibility of public servants versus the executive. I was a former public servant myself.
Would you have done this?
Public service. Well, I was taught to give frank and fearless advice and give apolitical and impartial advice to the government of the day in the nation's best interest.
Was this apolitical?
Well, I'm not going to make a judgment. I'm going to let the Public Service Commissioner make that judgment. I think that's important that those findings are handed down. I think it's important that the government acted very, very swiftly this morning to take that action.
Senator Paul Scarr, do you think he can really survive this?
Well, I think there is a process, PK, that has to be respected. So I think it was absolutely appropriate that he has stood down for the duration of the inquiry, and I agree with Peter. I think it's very important that the inquiry is expedited. And we're talking about a very important department here, the Department of Home Affairs. So I think it's absolutely vital that this process go through to a conclusion as soon as possible, and there's some certainty for the department in terms of its future leadership.
Is this the right process, Larissa?
I think it's important for there to be an inquiry, but if you look at our politics right now and think about Australian voters and how much our confidence in democratic institutions is being undermined, it's so important to see that there is action taken, but also overwhelmingly people believe that there are interests, whether it's from the far right or corporate interests, having control of our democratic institution. The Department of Home Affairs, you know, there was so much worry about creating this super portfolio, like giving Peter Dutton the Ministerial for everything with guns. And now you have all of these text messages, this kind of things that people believe is happening in our politics is right there for people to see. So we're talking about how we have faith in these institutions, and that goes to the amount of mis and disinformation in responses like COVID. There are so many different things that impact, but we need to get rid of him. I don't see how he can maintain a place in the public service.
Tom, do you think he can stay?
No, he won't survive. I mean, look, the public service, you know, they never absolutely get rid of their own, like he'll end up at, I don't know, in Antarctica or somewhere like that. But
he's paid a lot more than the Prime Minister.
Well, he is, but that just makes it a whole lot worse. I mean, as you know, as we heard before, you've got to be frank and fearless. I did a degree that was supposed to train public servants. I mean, thank God I never became one. But you know, the idea was you would serve whatever government there was of the day, and you had to do that to the best of your ability. And not that you can ever put your personal bias completely to one side, but you had to keep it in the background. And that's clearly not what's happened here. So he's gone.
Are you surprised he hasn't just resigned?
Well, I am, and I suspect he probably will. But, you know, the lure of, you know, whatever pension he's owed and that sort of thing might sort of keep him going. But it wouldn't surprise me if by the end of the week he's decided to step down, to spend more time with his family.
Of course, as everyone must. Next, we'll hear from Mote Dambo.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, Victoria endured one of the longest lockdowns in the world. Some of the impacts of these policy decisions are still felt in Victoria to date. How could the Albanese government's proposed inquiry enable proper scrutiny of state-based decision-making?
Peter Khalil, I'm going to start with you again.
Back to me again?
Yeah.
Thanks, Patricia.
Yeah.
Good question, thank you. The Prime Minister did announce an independent inquiry with a panel of experts to look at the Commonwealth's responses to the pandemic in order to actually come to a view about better preparedness for the future, better structures, better policy, so that we are better prepared in the future around a pandemic. And that is looking at the vaccination provision, treatment, medical supplies and supply chain issues. And of course, the panel of experts will have the flexibility and the ability to look at all of the issues, including some of the impacts around closures and or border closures, as well as lockdowns and so on, as part of their work. But the point I want to make about this is really important. The Prime Minister also said it the other day when he made the announcement. This is not about apportioning blame or finger pointing. It has to be a positive look forward about how we can be better in our policy and our structures to deal with pandemics into the future. It's a positive, forward-looking inquiry that assesses the best possible policy outcomes for the future.
Madeleine, do you think it should include the states and territories?
I think absolutely, because we are a nation that is made of many parts, and each state had a different experience. So for where I am Victorian by birth, but living up in northern New South Wales, our experience was far different to what you all experienced here, and we can only sympathise, but we can't empathise it. So I think that the investigation needs to include the voices of every part of Australia and everyone who was really impacted. Just speaking to anyone who worked in the emergencies departments, who will say, we did not know what we were dealing with. This was unknown territory, and we did the best that we could with the information that we had. And I think that was a broad-ranging experience. I think that that was something that certainly coloured and qualified how we responded. And hopefully, I think this, again, as Peter said, it needs to be forward-viewing. It needs to be, how do we make better decisions if this was to happen again?
Yeah, and I think that's the issue, though, Peter. How can you make better decisions about school closures, for instance, which had, I think, enormous impacts on young people, if you don't include that in the inquiry?
As I said earlier, to clarify, the panel of experts and their professors and economists and public health experts, they have the flexibility to examine those issues. That's up to them.
That's actually not in their terms of reference.
But they do have the flexibility to look at those issues.
Why not put it in their terms of reference?
And I will, well, you know, we've heard a lot of politicisation of this. I know Peter Dutton can't help himself. He has to politicise every single issue. He wants to sow discord and division. He wants to start pointing fingers and all the rest of it.
Peter.
Paul, it's true.
It's not Peter Dutton calling for the commission.
It's always the lowest common denominator politics. The Prime Minister's been very clear about the need to look forward about getting better policy outcomes so we are prepared as a nation
Would you like
to
to
protect
see the
Australians
states and territories
future.
in the terms of reference? So it's more explicit. So Mote's issue.
I think it's...
Peter, sorry, I respect what you're saying and thank you for the response, but I still feel it doesn't answer my question in full. I mean, the Victorian business community, you speak to anyone in small business during that period of time, you speak to casual workers, you speak to nurses, you speak to many people within the community, and not only in terms of an economic impact, but also a mental health impact.
Absolutely.
And I just feel like the question still isn't answered in terms of why, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'd love to hear from Senator Paul after, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I still feel like both within Victoria and nationwide, in terms of the Prime Minister's response, I feel like state-based decision-making, there's not a light on that and the decisions that were made.
So to answer your question directly, Mote, and obviously you want to hear from Senator Scarr, the inquiry will be able to look at the impact, mental health impact on people.
Will it be able to look at school closures?
Let me finish the answer. It will be able to look at all those decisions, border closures, school closures and so on. That is up to the independent panel of experts to examine all of those impacts. That's for them to do in doing their work. And you're right. There was a lot of impacts on small business. I remember during the pandemic doing a lot of support work for people in my community and small business, the impacts that people had with their kids with school closures. So that's up to the panel to look into all of those issues. But it can't be a finger-pointing exercise, just blame and sowing division. That's not what this is about. It's about better Commonwealth response for the future.
Senator Scarr.
This is about the people of Australia who went through unparalleled periods of lockdowns, of having their lives absolutely regimented and changed in ways which no one could ever have envisaged. And the people of Melbourne suffered those lockdowns more than anyone. So if you look at those terms of reference, first, it should be a Royal Commission with the powers of a Royal Commission.
I agree.
That's the first point, to make sure people have to come and give evidence, documents can be collected, etc. So it should be a Royal Commission. And secondly, it needs to look at what are referred to as those unilateral actions of the states. And that includes the lockdowns and it includes the closures of borders. And those lockdowns, one of the points in the terms of reference is that it's looking at the mental health support given to people in lockdown, but it should be looking at the purpose of lockdowns in the start, whether or not that was proportionate, whether or not that was appropriate. On what evidence was that undertaken? So when we are looking forward, and I agree with Peter, we need to look forward, we can decide whether or not that was the best way forward. And the people of Australia deserve that. So I call upon the Prime Minister to revisit this issue. It is not just Peter Dutton calling for a Royal Commission, it's the people of Australia, Peter, are calling for a Royal Commission.
Let me hear from some others. Larissa, do you think it should be a Royal Commission and include states and territories?
I do also agree. We think that it should be a Royal Commission and it should include states and territories. I think that our ability to campaign and talk to for First Nations people, and I know you can talk about the experience in Victoria, and it was awful. We were in Queensland. It was night and day, but in Aboriginal communities, especially in Central Australia, I think people forget that there was body bags sent into our communities. Like, there was no ability to access essential services. When we were talking about the vaccine rollout, they were like, how do you send refrigerated vaccine rollouts into remote areas? And so the ability for, we talked to so many Aboriginal communities whose young people, because the schooling system is woeful in remote areas, had their young people in Melbourne and Sydney and could not bring them home for months. That had huge impacts on people, sending people into a community where there is a housing crisis and you're having 30 people in a house. Now, where do you put everybody else? We were doing call-outs for tents to go into remote areas. There was a complete lack of resourcing for Aboriginal communities within the COVID response.
Just a quick response from you, Tom. I think I know what you've been saying on radio about this. You think it needs to encompass the states?
Well, it does. And to go back to the question, the reality is the bulk of what we experienced here in Melbourne was state-based. Hotel quarantine was awful, border closures, the Ring of Steel around Melbourne, playgrounds closed, schools closed. I'm a father of a teenage daughter. I mean, she still talks about how awful it was. The reality is, if you don't analyse those things, doesn't matter if they're state or federal, they all came out of National Cabinet, I might just add, which was a gathering. If you don't analyse those, you're not going to get the answers. So to only look at half, or not even half, probably 20% of the issues that were purely federal means that effectively the whole issue's being whitewashed.
Peter,
This gets us to the topic of our online poll. We're asking you, should there be a royal commission into the COVID-19 response that looks at all levels of government? You can cast your votes anonymously on the Q&A Facebook and YouTube accounts, or the ABC News X and Instagram accounts. We'll bring you the results later. Now, I'd like to bring in Kristen Trim.
Hello. I run a business that manages holiday rental properties on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. Over the last year, the short-term rental bookings have really slowed. Due to the increased cost of living and the interest rate hikes, consumers just don't have the money to spend on weekends away. My question is, why does the government think that it's appropriate to put an extra tax, i.e. the 7.5%, on top of the nightly rate of every stay in what will almost cripple a struggling accommodation industry and decimate the tourism in our Mornington Peninsula region and other regions? This has nothing to do with our housing crisis. I'd be interested in your opinions.
Yeah. Now, just to be clear, there's no representative of the Victorian government here, and it's a Victorian government, not just for our viewers at home too.
Yep. I know Tom has mentioned it on his radio.
So I'll start with you, Tom, because you say it has nothing to do with housing. The government in Victoria says it does have something to do with housing. It's about
I can speak to more of that as well.
Well, it doesn't really. I mean, the fact is that the bulk of short-stay accommodation in Victoria is other Victorians. It's Victorians holidaying in their own state, which you would have thought the state government would like to do. I mean, if you want to keep money within the state, then if you go to Wilson's Prom or Mornington Peninsula or wherever, that should be good. So to tax Victorians and dissuade them from holidaying in our own state is dumb. All right, that's that. Secondly, the government has a problem with social housing. Right, Airbnb accommodation is not the solution to social housing. It's a classic, what they call hypothecation of revenue. We have a housing problem over here, social housing. Oh, we have another bunch of housing here which we think is making money. Let's tax that to try and solve that. And I would just say, why? You don't have to have a tax on one sort of housing to try and fix another sort.
I think there is a consensus, though, isn't there, Larissa, that there is an issue around Airbnb and the growth and the consequence being a lack of longer-term rentals.
Well, maybe, but that's a separate thing. Look, lack of longer-term rentals is not the same as social housing. They're different things.
No, but OK, I'm just asking Larissa on
and
longer-term rentals.
I would say also this is it is trying to treat a symptom of the housing crisis. I think if you look at the problem of Airbnbs and you look, I grew up in the Northern Rivers, the amount of people that moved up there during COVID, absolutely, this is a low socioeconomic area. It is impossible for families to get reasonable housing within that. So, yes, there needs to be some looking at how we look at Airbnbs, but the reality is we're looking at state and territory and federal governments who have refused to fund a housing crisis for many, many years. This is decades of inaction, of not funding social housing, of not making affordable housing for young people, and we are, are my generation going to be able to own homes? Probably not. We need to build much more than is on offer right now.
So, Peter, how does this help supply?
Well, it is all about supply, and let's be really clear about this. We are in a housing crisis, and it's about supply, supply, supply. And, Kristen, I respect your point about you have a business to run. This is a Victorian state tax, an Airbnb tax. No one's going to force you not to put those out on short-stay rentals, but there is a housing crisis, and we need to address it. And the money that's going to come out of that particular tax is going to be reinvested back into social and affordable housing. Let's have a look at the facts. 36,000 houses in Victoria, 29,000 of which are actual houses, not just apartments, are used for short-stay rental. There was a story about a lovely regional town called Bright in which the local butcher couldn't even... He'd spent 6 months living in the back of his van because he couldn't rent a place for him and his family. He was the new butcher in town because half of the accommodation in the town was short-stay rental. Now, I'm very passionate about housing. I grew up in public housing. It gave a roof over the head for my migrant family when we first came to Australia. It gave us an opportunity to settle, to get an education, to make our contribution. And this is not just about social and public housing, as important it is as a houser. It's also about affordable homes. There are people who in their 20s who are lining up for 6 hours to look at a rental property.
Yeah, but the question
it's $800 a week, and the taps don't work. There is no
The question is,
property
how
out there.
does this resolve that?
Yeah.
And I don't think it does.
You don't think
I
it
really
does?
don't think it does.
The money is being reinvested into social and affordable housing from that particular tax. State and federal governments, this
But
is
I
the
think
whole
on a
government...
national
Let's just hear
level,
Madeleine,
we
yeah.
labour under a misconception that all Airbnbs are rich people have multiple houses that are no one is living in them, and they're rented out purely for an income. Whereas the majority of, like
Kristen, yeah.
will be sort of ma and pa Airbnb operators. They might have a front room or a separate dwelling that they're renting out to pay off their own mortgage. So it's saying, well, then let's steal from Peter to pay Paul.
Okay.
As opposed to addressing
All right.
the greater issue.
Full declaration. We've been doing this on this show. Who's renting out on Airbnb? Put your hand up. None of you. None of you are in the Airbnb world. You are.
The holiday rental market is not the cause or the solution of the housing crisis.
Yes, okay, but okay, so there's a 7.5% tax. It starts in 2025 is my understanding. Will you just pass that on to consumers?
Well, Airbnb will, so Airbnb and Stays and every rental platform will pass it on.
You think it will lead to fewer people staying in the property?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the reason that most of the property managers, property owners that I manage their property, they are holiday houses. They're never going to be permanent rentals. So it's never going to be, oh, we're, passed on too many taxes. We're now going to permanently rent our house. That's never going to happen. They're potentially going to be forced to sell their house, and that's at the punishment of them for being well off and having another property that they can call a holiday home. So they're just trying to get an extra bit of income out of that holiday home to offset the land tax, all of the new the electricity fees, and all of the increases that have been put to them.
PK, I think this is a great decision for Queensland.
Because you'll get more people to Queensland.
Absolutely.
You're really exactly right.
The Victorian Premier imposing a tax on businesses like Christine. It's a great decision for Queensland.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, good for you.
Absolutely.
Dan Andrews says it's a modest charge, this 7.5%, very modest. But that's not taking into account some of the properties that we manage, which are beautiful homes, and they're $1,000 a night. So, $2,000 for a weekend. That's $150 at the 7.5 rate, or 500 odd on a on a
I can
week.
understand, but
That's
can
not
you understand
modest.
people might be watching this
Saying that's a ridiculous amount of money to
I can't spend $1,000 a night to go to a fancy house when they can't get a house to live in?
I get that. I do get that. But they're not mutually exclusive. It's, as I said, it's not. The holiday rental market isn't causing the housing crisis. We've got 8 million tourists that come each year to the Mornington Peninsula alone. They're not day trippers. They need somewhere to live, to stay.
Yeah.
So, and those houses aren't taking the permanent rentals off someone. They're just putting livelihood into the region and getting the tourism dollar happening, which we need desperately.
So just to be clear,
I'm sorry, Patricia, I've got to say this. Housing is a fundamental human right. And right now there are people that cannot get a home. They cannot even get into the market, the rental market. All right? We have a housing crisis. Now, this is not the only policy. There is a suite of initiatives. There's investment. We've passed the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. We've built up on renters' rights. We've spent $3 billion on the National Homes Accord from 1.2 million homes to be built. There's a suite of things that have to be done by state and federal governments. But for too long, the idea of housing is skewed more to it being more of an investment vehicle. I understand that people are structured around that, but housing is a fundamental human right, and we need to get this right as a society. We need to actually do what...
But Peter, you seem to be thinking that you're acting like these landlords who have this evil thing about, oh, I'm going to rent out a house so people can go and have a little holiday or something. If it's a fundamental human right, why don't you, as part of a federal government, do something about it?
We've actually spent billions of dollars.
Taxing people who have a holiday house for rental is not doing something. It's handballing the problem to someone else.
Okay, but
do we need to reimagine how housing looks to make it more sustainable, to make it more accessible? Does it taking swathes of land that aren't currently considered desirable and creating communities that are interactive and sustainable, that maybe are growing their own food made of hemp or something that's environmentally sustainable? It means reimagining the paradigm, because we're not doing that at the moment. We're just going, let's just blow up the taxes and then there's more dollars to go over there. I mean, we saw it play out in Byron in the middle of the floods. There were 2,000 some houses on Airbnb and only 200 were made available for people who'd lost everything. So I understand how we can labour under the misconception, but I don't think ma and pa operators need to be made responsible in order to fix the housing crisis.
Do we really think, though? Do we really think as a society that it's acceptable that almost half of the accommodation in regional Victoria, for example, is short stay accommodation?
But I also think we're still
But what about
talking
the
about
people
a
in-
symptom, right? This is a housing crisis. What is on the table from every government in this country is not enough to deal with it. And I think that there is always going to be pitting different people against each other, but until governments get their act together and actually invest in the type of infrastructure and that we need regionally in this country, we're not going to solve the housing crisis.
But it's not just about government. It's not just about government. You need people who are prepared to buy properties to rent them. And if you make it too difficult for people to make that decision to buy a property and then to rent it out, and there's a lot of landlords who are leaving the market.
But in this case, I don't think
it makes it
people
much
having
more
Airbnb
difficult.
properties are thinking of the struggling
Long-term.
people who are
Yeah.
trying to rent them, are they?
Absolutely, but you've
But
got to
they're
look
not,
at the
are they?
perspective.
That's not
You've got to
true.
look at the perspective of the landlords as well. If you make it too difficult for the landlords, you won't have landlords, and that's not going to be good for the rental market either.
And they're not devoid of taxes, the landlords.
Absolutely.
They've
But
got
it's
the
also,
land
if
tax
young
and
people could buy
all other
houses, they
taxes.
could also pay
I mean,
taxes on
this
it.
is, yeah,
Because
you're right, Larissa. It's intergenerational
Yeah.
inequality here. Let's really be serious. Anyone that's under 50 here, or 40 or 30, in their 20s or 30s, would know exactly what I'm talking about. The difficulty of actually getting an affordable home, it's next to impossible.
So, Tom, do you think Airbnb is an issue that needs to be dealt with in another way?
Well, look, if you want a tourism industry in Victoria, as I said, in Victoria, the bulk of people who stay in Airbnbs are other Victorians.
So you think Airbnb needs no reform?
No, it's not that it might need no reform, it might. But the point is this, the people who have struggled to earn or to buy a property to invest in, whether they rent it out short-term or long-term, or, to be honest, if they want to leave it empty and not earn any income, I can't imagine why someone would do that, but maybe someone will. Governments need to sort out the housing mess themselves. The solution can't always be another tax, and that's my point. You know,
Now-
you've got your $10 billion housing fund up with the Greens. I know you fought hard for that, and I think it's a good policy. Focus on that and less upon taxing people.
Now, if you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Madeleine West, Peter Khalil, Paul Scarr, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts and Tom Elliott. Lots to discuss tonight. Let's go to Danny Free.
As the succession plan comes into play for the Murdoch empire, my question looks at the lack of integrity and ethics that seem to be endemic within these corporate and political structures where power and greed seem to rule. How do we prevent the successors from thinking that this type of behaviour is acceptable?
I might start with you, Larissa.
I also watch Succession and they're all the same, so it doesn't matter that a different Murdoch is taking over. I think we need to, and we have campaigned for a long time at GetUp to address media ownership in this country. We're looking at 70% of Murdoch ownership right across this country, and it means that if you live in a regional and a remote area, then all you are hearing is misinformation. If you look at things like COVID, like the current debate around the referendum and how much these people are putting up people who are just spouting absolute nonsense, we actually need to have information that matters to people being accessible to them. And when we have corporate media capturing basically all the information in this country, it has a huge impact on our democracy.
And yet here we are on the ABC. We're on the ABC where we're all having an opportunity to give our opinion. And from my perspective, that's a reflection of the diversity of media.
There's not a diversity of media in Australia.
Of course there is.
It's
That's
owned
where
by
we're sitting here
One of the
on
most
the
concentrated-
ABC.
Just because there's a
One of the most
public
concentrated
broadcaster,
media
so you're
markets in the world.
ignoring all the ownership by Murdoch and what he has spouted and the types of things. Like, you look in this debate around the referendum and their unfair coverage of the way people are talking about misinformation, the things that they are saying about Aboriginal communities right now is completely untrue. And all of their hosts, look at the research.
If people want to watch the ABC, they can watch the ABC. If they want to
But
watch
in
Sky, they
regional
can watch
areas,
Sky.
not everybody has the ability to do that.
I think with the internet, the ABC, across the whole of Australia, the options are there. We
You
have
think
more
in
diversity.
remote and regional areas people have access to the internet everywhere?
Well, I don't know about
No, they
everywhere, but the
don't.
ABC...
Well, you should know.
The ABC...
Well, I just want to go to Madeleine, because the question was about succession, particularly of the Murdochs. And I know there was a very interesting piece essentially saying that perhaps the wrong son was picked. There is a view that perhaps Lachlan's brother would have been a better option.
Well,
But
you know
the
what?
idea of succession,
Well,
the idea of a family dominating.
We love a dynasty. We are
Do we?
a society that loves a dynasty. That's why we're still a monarchy, essentially. That we love the idea of there being a king or a queen who reigns supreme, and that idea of them holding onto the throne by controlling the succession. That, okay, then maybe the solution is don't buy into anything behind the paywall. If that's how we feel about it, then just stick with free media, and we have a free press, and that's how we've managed to get some really critical information across to the masses, that we will continue to invest in that idea because we love it.
But I also
we enjoy it. We like the drama.
The idea of a paywall is also really anti-democratic as well.
Yeah.
I think that the incredible impact that paywalls have had on investigative journalism, like globally, is really
Well,
important.
okay, but as perhaps the one person here who actually works in commercial media, I can tell you, we would love it if the
I've worked in
Australian
commercial
taxpayer,
media.
we have, but we'd love it if the Australian taxpayer gave us $1 billion a year to do whatever, but they don't. Without that paywall, it doesn't exist. And I can tell you, when Rupert Murdoch dies, a lot of these regional newspapers you criticise will shut down because they are only kept alive because he happens to love newspapers. They don't make any money.
Have you read them and the things that
Yes,
they
I
say?
have, but what I'm saying is they will disappear, but there won't
You
be
don't
anything
think
else that
Lachlan will
springs
keep them
up.
going?
No, he won't, because the fact is I don't think Lachlan's going to last all that long anyway.
Why not?
Well, because one is you shouldn't have dynastic succession in what is, after all, a public company owned by its shareholders. The Murdochs own, I think it's 39%, not 100%. That's point one. Point two, Rupert's been very good at holding it together, and he's done an amazing job. And he built that out of a single newspaper in Adelaide. But I don't know if Lachlan's got the ability to do it. But the bean counters will get in, and they will start shutting things down that don't make money. And I can tell you bring up a paywall. Without paywalls, there are no newspapers.
But I'm saying,
there aren't any.
should all the paywalls be owned by the same family?
Well, okay. The thing, and I take issue with this whole idea about media concentration. The media's never been more diverse because of things like social media, because of the fact that any one of you can start a YouTube channel or whatever. You never could do that prior to the invention of the technology we now have.
Saved by Twitter that's now owned by Elon Musk.
Well, all I'm saying is, you know what the hardest thing to do in media these days is to get people's attention because they've got so many things to look at. You try and get a 13, 14, 15-year-old to read a newspaper or watch free-to-air TV, they don't do it. And they'll probably never do it. And in fact, our biggest worry, again, at the radio station I'm on, and we're owned by Channel 9, is, oh my God, how do we even get the next generation to look at the stuff that we produce? It's the other way around. They've got so many things to do.
Yeah,
look at every kid wandering around staring at their phone. A generation ago, that didn't exist. Now, it's not a solution for regional voices and all that, but I guarantee this. Rupert will be dead in a few years, anytime. He's 92. A lot of those newspapers will be shut down. Nothing will come up to replace them, and then you'll be sitting there saying, right, what do we do now?
Tony Abbott was nominated on the Fox board. Was that an early sign of the direction under Lachlan?
I think, Patricia, there's a deeper fundamental point here which Larissa was trying to sort of talk to earlier. I watch Succession as well, Larissa, and I've conflated the Murdoch and the Succession, the fiction with the reality. I don't really care. Everyone's sort of fixated on this Succession. But the deeper point is we have to have diversity in the media. We have to have a diversity of perspectives. We have to have a broad-based media because it's a fundamental tenet of a successful democracy. And we have one of the highest concentrations of media markets in the world. We're still fortunate in that we have the only one of 4 countries in the world that has a state-based independent media. And I'm biased. I used to work at SBS, so I think public broadcasting and investment in public broadcasting is absolutely critical to the functioning of our democracy. And to your point, Tom, about the so many platforms that people can use, this is part of the problem. The fracturing of the media, where, people used to go to work on Monday.
It can't be concentrated and fractured.
Let me make
it can't
the
be
point.
both.
Let me make the point. Where people used to go, at the water fountain and talk about, the news of the day, and they might disagree about what they saw. Now they're disagreeing on facts. And there's a complete fracturing of reality in many respects because anyone can put out a YouTube channel. So I think public broadcasting is absolutely critical to the functioning of the Australian democracy.
And what did you think of the Tony Abbott appointment? I asked that and you avoided it.
Well, I did a very good job of avoiding it.
You clearly didn't, because I've come back to it.
This was made by Rupert. I don't know. He's on the board. I didn't even know about it.
Good luck to him.
Yeah, well,
good luck to him.
Are you happy for him?
Absolutely.
What does it say, though, about the direction of the company?
Well, I think it says they've chosen Tony Abbott, given his skills in terms of media, and he was involved in media, as we all know, before he went into politics, and he brings that perspective.
It has
Good luck
nothing to
him.
do with him being it's about you thinking that Conservative politicians being on your board, being elected, being in Parliament is actually going to serve the interests of Murdoch media.
Sorry, Larissa, it's not up to you or me to determine who should be serving on the board of that company. It's up to the shareholders themselves to determine that. And that's the way it should be.
Next, we're going to hear from Chris Mulheron.
Yeah, thank you. My question is also about diversity and social polarisation. It seems to me that in many of the debates that we're having, people on one side can't seem to even hear that the people on the other side might have reasons for why they believe what they believe. So my question is to Paul and Larissa, as leaders in the referendum on opposite sides. Larissa, can you think of any good reasons why somebody might vote no in the referendum? And Paul, can you think of any good reasons why somebody might vote yes in the referendum?
This is like at the end of a job interview, isn't it? You know, what are the things you're not good at? Let me ask you first, Larissa. You were the first part of the question.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time going out into communities and having conversations with everyone. I don't know when I approach people what their political persuasion is. And I think what I hear overwhelmingly is that people don't have faith in our institutions. When I hear people saying that they're voting no, they say they don't trust government. They don't trust the government to deliver these things they give me. Especially when I'm working in Aboriginal communities, I have so many people talk about their lived experience around how governments have done bad things and why should we believe that this government is going to do. So I can really absolutely believe why people would vote no. The other thing is that we live in a digital age where everything that we believe is kind of spat back at us by algorithms. And so if you are for or no, that's all you hear. If you're for or yes, we live in bubbles, and we are at the mercy of these algorithms, and we don't have the type of regulation and the facts on what is the truth that is actually out there, and so it polarises people. And actually, the algorithm works more, and the best way for things to go viral is to start an argument. And so we have these platforms that don't really create a space where we have a space for decency or dignity in conversations anymore. And we're seeing that play out widely through this referendum, and people feeling like, talking to people and they're like, I don't even know what this referendum is about, and I don't want to get involved in this argument because I just want to know what I'm going to do on referendum day, and I don't know where to go to get the right information.
The other part of the question was for you?
Sure. And it's a very good question. And I can understand people who want to address the marginalisation, especially in remote and regional communities amongst our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, feeling the emotional pull to want to vote yes. I can deeply understand that. And I deeply respect all the advocates on both sides of the argument, including Larissa, in terms of her advocacy. But from my perspective, it's a question of assessing the risks and the costs in terms of going down that path, in terms of entrenching into our constitution a new institution which is not open to the full and equal participation of all Australians. And as a matter of principle, I simply cannot support that.
That institution would be completely controlled by the Parliament, and in fact the Prime Minister has offered to put a coalition person as a co-chair of a parliamentary committee to construct that body. Doesn't that give you some?
The body would not be totally controlled by Parliament.
It's actually in the
Well, sorry,
change.
let me finish. The change actually says the power of the Parliament to legislate with respect to the functions and powers is subject to the Constitution. And the second limb of the constitutional amendment is what actually provides the voice, the so-called voice, with the power to make representations to both Parliament and to executive government. So that's where the constitutional overlay occurs. And this would be introducing a new chapter into Australia's constitution. So just as there's a chapter for Houses of Parliament, there's a chapter for executive government, for the courts, there would be a chapter for the voice. So this would be a very, very powerful institution under our constitution. There's a lack of detail, there's legal risks,
is that a
and it would be
argument?
permanent. And it would be permanent. It would be permanent.
So, as a parliamentarian, we make better decisions when we talk to stakeholders, when we talk to community leaders, constituents, we get advice from them. It helps inform our decision-making. This is a simple proposal. It's about a voice and advisory committee that will provide advice to the government, the executive government and the parliament to get better policy outcomes. I think everyone can understand the importance of that.
So why does it need to be in the Constitution, Peter? Why couldn't you do it
So
tomorrow?
that your government can't remove it in the future?
And why would a government remove it in the future?
Because they have.
Why did you get
And
rid
why
of
did
ATSIC?
they?
Like,
Why?
No, because
Well, I can
they
tell you,
have.
because it was corrupt,
Well,
because it
excuse
was
me,
ineffective.
we just have a
and it
conversation
wasn't
about
working.
Home Affairs,
And it wasn't working.
Home Affairs portfolio
And it
and the
was
corruption and what happened in
Well, sorry, you
robo-debt
asked me
and
a
human
question.
services.
You're asking me a
presupposing
You
something's
didn't
gonna
get rid of those
You're
Okay,
asking
one
me a
person at a
question.
time.
You're asking me a question. ATSIC was abolished on a bipartisan basis, on the basis it wasn't working.
That's rubbish.
And that's... Well,
Like,
sorry, it's
No,
not.
Mark
It's a fact.
Latham was the Labor leader. I was there that day, and now he's
That's
a
right.
One Nation MP.
So,
He's been
Larissa, you
actually
can talk about
rejected
misinformation,
from One
No,
Nation.
but
you want to be careful in terms of when you come back and accuse other people of saying rubbish. So if we're going to have a respectful debate, as BK
The
said,
debate around ATSIC
was abolished because it was corrupt, ineffective, and it didn't represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander
That's the
people
story
in those remote
that you
and regional
tell.
communities.
No. That's not, like, if you go out into remote and regional areas and you ask them and talk about, okay, we're going to a referendum and then we're going to talk about what this representative body, that's all it is, what it looks like. One of the things you hear overwhelmingly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is the last representative body that we felt like we had any ability to talk to each other and to government was ATSIC. There were very good parts of ATSIC, and the stories that are told about it is not a fair telling around what happened. We need to, let's be honest about policy when it comes to First Nations and Indigenous affairs in this country. Governments don't get it right. And it isn't, unless we have actual governments, and when we see report after report where governments are doing things right, is because they are working with First Nations communities.
Absolutely.
This is what is on offer, and you're scaremongering about what it is going to mean going into
You're presupposing what happened in the past is going to happen in the future.
I've got a question. Like, when there are corrupt members of Parliament, why don't you call for the abolition of Parliament?
Well, I just don't think...
It's a genuine question about, because there are often dodgy figures.
The other thing is,
but maybe this is what this will prompt. Maybe this whole question about the Constitution and how our nation operates, if we're going to ask big questions, maybe it's going to wake the Australian public up to the fact that change is possible, that we actually have the power to implement change. Our whole legal system can be overthrown if there is enough of a push for it. And I'm just going to say this quickly. The argument that we're having at this table, even though we're all here wanting to disseminate facts, is not dissimilar to what is turning people away from the issue. I had a conversation with my kids about this last night. And
how old are they?
Just to give us from 17 down to 8.
Yep.
There's 6 of them.
Wow.
And predominantly the perception was, my heart says, yes, we need to hear the voices of Indigenous people. I cannot even begin to imagine the pain that they have experienced. And I know that there are arguments that we can't be responsible for what happened hundreds of years ago, but I believe in intergenerational trauma, and that what one person experiences passes on to their children, to their children, to their children. My head feels confused. There is so much argument, there's so much backbiting, because this is an issue that should be uniting us, and yet it is dividing us. And my gut feels that the Australian public wants to do what is right. They want to ensure that people are heard. But by the same token, we will revert. When we're confronted, when we're confused, when we don't understand, we will revert to conservatism. That doesn't mean I'm saying I'm going to oppose it, but if I don't understand it, I'm not going to consent to it. And that's where we find ourselves in this impossible situation.
And that's a wise decision in relation to our nation's constitution.
No, I'm not saying not to vote. No,
it is
that's
a
what I'm
wise
saying.
decision.
How do we clarify it without dividing us? How do we focus on what unites us, not what divides us? Because that is the end of all civilization.
But your presupposition is that there is a right path here, and that if people could just see it, they would go down that path. People disagree. I had dinner with an old school friend recently. He's had, I think, 3 Indigenous boys live with him. They've come down to school in Melbourne from very remote parts of Australia. And so he's got an interesting perspective. And we started talking about the voice, and look, I'm against it for not dissimilar reasons. But it very much came down to his point of view was Indigenous people are different and they need to be treated differently. And my point of view is, no, they are not different. We are all people, and yes, we have some differences, but we should all be treated the same. But that was our fundamental difference. He sees, this old friend of mine, we didn't argue about it, just had a civilised discussion. He sees and continues to see Indigenous people as fundamentally different from everybody else.
But the outcomes for Indigenous people are really
Maybe they are, but I don't see them as different.
the outcomes are by fact different.
And the lived experience.
But philosophically speaking, and I know it's easy to say, oh, that's just rubbish, But if his worldview is that they're different, my worldview is that they are not. We will not agree on it. And so this idea that we can agree, we will not. He will vote yes and I will vote no. And essentially that's where we split. And a lot of people feel like that.
PK, why aren't we celebrating the fact that when I sit in the Senate, there are 8 senators, 8 out of 76, who are wonderful Indigenous Australians, who are elected to our Senate under our current constitution, representing all parties, different lived experiences, different perspectives
I think that is
and
a
different
source of
philosophies.
celebration,
It is.
but they don't represent necessarily Indigenous
represent,
people, do they?
Paul, they represent their states. They're elected officials who represent their states, including non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people. Like, the fundamental question before all of us as a nation, and we are at a crossroads as a nation at this referendum, it's a seminal moment in our history. The question before us is, do you believe that the Voice, the Advisory Committee, will lead to better policy outcomes for Indigenous Australians? The people who drafted the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the decades of work by Indigenous leaders, the vast majority of Indigenous Australians that put this offer to us say this will lead to better policy outcomes because we can advise on the direction around our people and what it means to us. And the question before us is whether we believe the constitutional recognition and the Advisory Committee will lead to those better policy outcomes. I believe they will. As a parliamentarian, that kind of advice to me helps inform my decision making, and I know many of my colleagues, and that's why I'm voting yes.
Okay. Now I'd like to bring in Isabella Scarpato.
To what extent do you think money and or culture has driven Australian universities' wildly inadequate and disturbing response to sexual violence experienced by students in university contexts?
I'll put that to you, Paul, because you're the chair of a Senate committee that looked at this issue.
Thanks so much for that question. I think there is a major issue at our universities in terms of sexual assault of students, and our university sector is not doing enough. And as chair of a Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee that looked into this, we were deeply disturbed at the statistics that are coming out of our universities. So we're talking about the last study that was done, 1 in 90 students is the victim of a sexual assault every 12 months on our universities. 5% of our university students suffer a sexual assault in a university setting over the course of their degree. And there are fundamental questions that have to be asked of our university sector as to why that state of affairs is occurring.
And are they adequately answering it?
And no, they're not, PK. They aren't. And they've had time. The Australian Human Rights Commission brought down a report in 2017 that was quite damning in terms of statistics. And our inquiry, we were quite shocked by the response of the universities. The previous government gave the university sector $1.5 million to come up with a campaign to address sexual assault on our university campuses, and our universities were incapable of coming up with a campaign that the 39 universities would agree to. They actually came back to the government and said, we can't deliver this campaign. It's absolutely damning. But the most damning thing of all is that the victim advocates, so the advocates for people who've suffered sexual assault on our universities, they're telling us, and we heard horrifying evidence in camera, that the process of someone actually making a complaint in our universities and going through that process is re-traumatising them. It's actually, and this is their words, as bad as the initial assault. And we heard such disturbing evidence in camera with respect to the situation that students have suffered on our university campuses. So from my perspective, now is the time for intervention. I think the self-regulation model in this regard has not worked. There needs to be an independent task force and there needs to be action. Enough is enough. The universities that are doing the right thing have nothing to fear. The universities that aren't doing the right thing, they should, to be frank, expect action to be taken.
Madeleine, I know this is an issue that you've been an advocate on generally, these issues. Are you disturbed to hear about the response from universities?
I'm not surprised at all. We're looking at, this is a scourge. Sexual abuse, that the complete obviation of consent. The stats hold up. 1 in 3 women will experience some kind of sexual violence. 1 in 6 men. So the university statistics are no great shock. And I think that, as you mentioned really clearly, one of the most difficult things is prompting victims to come forward and report, because the mechanisms aren't there. The support is not there. She said it's re-triggering because you're reliving the trauma, and often the way in which it's handled is guided by protocol, which is, well, where did it happen? What was the date? Who did it? What did you do? What were you wearing? And that's why we have, in our court system alone, in rape cases, will attract 2% convictions, because the victim is basically made out to be the perpetrator. There's so much blame and shame around sexual crime and sexually motivated crime that, first and foremost, we need to identify the vulnerabilities. What makes people vulnerable about that? Rather than focusing on the cure, how do we prevent it happening in the first place? How do we make people feel, yes, there is a safe reporting mechanism for you to approach, and hence those who have any compulsion to commit these crimes in the first place might feel deterred. There is so much work that needs to be done in this sector, and our halls of education, those institutions, need to be the front runners. They need to demonstrate how it's done, because that in itself will impact the next generation, how they perceive the crime.
And Madeleine, one of the most disturbing things is we had detailed case studies of students who've suffered sexual assault, and you sort of had this expectation that the institution's going to wrap its arms around them and help them get through their experience, finish their studies, etc. And it's quite the contrary in some cases. It's absolutely appalling.
In some cases, it's across society that all of the rehabilitative focus is on the perpetrator. Victims are just left to carry this cross of shame and blame that they've somehow done something wrong. Whereas socially we go, well, look, why did they do that? How do we fix that so that we can reinsert them in society, as opposed to going to the victims, you know what? You've done absolutely nothing wrong. And we're going to do everything within our power, and we're going to give you financial resource to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and that B, that you can live a happy, fulfilling life and know that justice has been done. And right now, I do not see justice being done in this sector at all.
Peter, Khalil, should universities be intervened into? Should they be held to account if they're not using the money as they should be?
Yeah, look, Patricia, first of all, acknowledging your advocacy, Madeleine, and the work that your committee did, Paul, because it's not often reported there was no conflict, but parliamentarians did good work on that committee across the aisle. Greens, Labor, Liberal, and they come up with very good recommendations to move policy, and well done on that.
It actually does happen.
Yeah, it does happen.
The
but
system works sometimes.
Sometimes it's good. And so committees do good work. So I know that the Minister for Education, Jason Clare, also came out quite strongly and backed in what you said, his criticism of the university sector. He's appointed Paddy Kernersley, who's the CEO of Our Watch, and she'll be putting forward in a working group concrete actions that need to be taken by government. That's a good first step. I think the recommendations in your committee report also need to be considered by the minister, and I know Jason is looking at those very, very closely.
Yeah, and I hope that's the case, Peter, because from my perspective, the time for working groups has passed, and now's the time for intervention to make sure universities do the right thing.
There is one aspect of the question that we haven't dealt with, and that is the extent to which universities being money hungry and going for profit. And one of the big changes I see from when I was at university the best part of 40 years ago versus now, back then I don't know if they made a profit or not, but they have become degree factories, and hence anything that makes the degree factory look bad is to be shuffled off to one side. So I agree with you. I think that the focus on profit making by universities has all sorts of consequences, and one of them is just to cover up bad news, like what you told us about.
And as a student, that's a huge concern, and that's what many of us think.
Yep.
Now, if this discussion is raising any difficulties for you or anyone you know, the numbers for Lifeline, 1800 RESPECT and Kids Helpline are there on your screen now. And we can bring you the result of our online poll now. We asked you, should there be a royal commission into the COVID-19 response that looks at all levels of government? More than 8,300 of you responded. Here's how you voted. 75% said yes. 25% said no. And interestingly, no one says they're unsure. There you go. It's the first time I actually think I've ever recorded no one being unsure. To finish tonight's discussion, here's Rowan Farron.
Within a modern world where young men and boys have been shown to be falling behind their peers in academia and most alarmingly in their mental health, how does the panel feel about the appointment of a Minister for Men to address the unique difficulties which face men in a modern Australia?
Larissa.
So I would say, I understand, like, a lot of people are feeling like, a lot of people are hurting right now. I think there is a misconception that it is people that are fighting for gender equality that are causing the pain that men are experiencing right now. I have 7 brothers, and we've had, dealt with a lot of mental illness, talking about suicide. I understand and I empathise that, what is the role of men in society right now? But I would say that actually step back and look at the bigger picture and think about, well, actually, why is it, the vision of men that was built after the Second World War, the idea of you needing to be these kind of success magnets that were the breadwinners maybe that is a toxic vision of who men should be. And actually we should look at how does a society create spaces where, we're looking after and building, good structures and communities around young people. But so much of what is happening on online platforms right now is also really concerning. I was talking to my 11-year-old nephew a number of weeks ago, and he could tell me all the misinformation that was out there around someone like Andrew Tate, and I was like, whoa, why are you listening to this guy? But the idea that we are being preyed upon by women and feminists, and having my 11-year-old nephew saying these things no, you're loved by so many people. And I understand that there is more that is to be done here. I think that governments do need to invest into things. There is a suicide crisis with young men that is happening right now, and it needs to be addressed. But when you address mental health and suicide crisis nationally, you also will help men as well within this situation. So I just don't believe that it is the role of feminists or people arguing for gender equality that are creating the situation. But I do acknowledge it.
Would it be useful to have a Minister for Men?
I don't think we need to have a Minister for Men. I think we need parliamentarians to do their job and stop focusing on, we are a very wealthy nation. We can afford to have these services. If we can lift the state of mental health crisis in regional and remote areas, then as it is going to lift the kind of access and services that men have access to. I've been through situations in the last year of losing my dad. And one of the things that really struck home to me is he was a man in his 70s who was of a generation that didn't complain and didn't say that he was sick. And had we known that earlier, we would have been able to get him help. Yep. And so I just think that we need to look at the attitudes around our society more generally.
Madeleine?
I think it's all attitude-based, and I think maybe more than a Minister for Men, we need a minister for meritocracy, for equality. How do we create an actually even playing field that's guided by the tenets of kindness, respect, empathy, irrespective of your gender, the colour of your skin, your socio-economic reality? How do we make that our guiding light? How do we teach the next generation that the greatest gift you can give someone is to demonstrate respect and kindness? Doesn't matter where they're coming from or where we're going. We're all on a journey together. I know that sounds broad brushstrokes, but as Larissa said, if we create spaces that celebrate people for what they are, celebrate men for being men, celebrate women for being women, celebrate everyone who identifies in between for the incredible contribution we're making to a society, focusing on the positives rather than negatives. Again, what unites us, what not divides us. Less secularisation, more unity. That's the ministry we need.
I'm going to whip around to all the men. Tom.
Well, I'm a sceptic of government, so I don't think having a Minister for Men is really going to achieve anything. But I would say this, Madeleine, you talk about respect, and, a lot of that just comes from family and from teachers and from friends. It's, if someone's doing the wrong thing, there's been ads on TV saying, call him out, don't behave like that. And I think kicking it up to a federal government level is probably not the way to do it. I personally think that men, or people really, need to be responsible a lot more for their own actions. So I would just say, if you've got friends who behave badly, say something. If you've got a member of your family who you think is doing something wrong, again, speak up. I just don't think having a federal government minister would achieve a great deal.
And the role of role models. I think that we've tended to let our kids be guided by social media, they grow up on it, that's their nanny, so to speak. But the power of role models, that for young men, the whole rites of passage, go out into the wilderness and, not saying have your first kill, but just that notion of having a strong role model to give you guidance.
Well, there is Harry Styles. Just saying. Do you think there should be a Minister for Men?
Well, just taking up Madeleine's point, no, I don't, but the role models is so important. And I've got a friend who came to this country as a refugee from Sudan. He's a soccer coach, and I see the influence he has on the young men in his soccer team and how he transforms those young men, gives them purpose, gives them a sense of achievement, and that the role that those community groups, sporting groups play is absolutely crucial, I think. But I'm with Tom. I'm not for bigger government. I don't think we need a minister for men.
Peter, should a woman be the minister for men?
You know, the men's health...
Tony Abbott was the Minister for Women.
Yeah, I was going to say, you mentioned Tony Abbott.
That.
Tony Abbott was Minister for Women, and the Labor government actually has more than 50% women in our caucus. So, you know, if we're ever going to go down that path, we would have a Labor woman as a Minister for Men. Go figure. But I think these issues are really serious because men's health issues and the high rates of suicide in men, and we often don't ask for help or seek help. It's a kind of a cultural thing as well. I will give a plug to Emma McBride, who's our Minister for Mental Health, Assistant Minister for Mental Health. She's been working really hard on the National Suicide Prevention Program and obviously a real focus on men's health and mental health in that space. So we've kind of already got a Labor woman who's a Minister for men, helping them out.
Anthony Albanese has never appointed her the Minister for Men,
No,
but you just did.
She's doing a lot of work to help men.
I'd love to hear that conversation in caucus. Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you to our panel, Madeleine West, Peter Khalil, Paul Scarr, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts and Tom Elliott. Thank you for sharing your stories and questions. Next week, I'll be with you again live from Melbourne, joining the panel Melandiri McCarthy, Dan Tian, Noel Pearson, Pia Miranda and Chris Merritt. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Have a great night. Go the Magpies.
Magpies.